Hey everyone, welcome to the 15th installment of the Inside JABA Series. In this installment, Editor-in-Chief Dr. John Barrero and I chat with Drs. Lesleigh Stinson and Jesse Dallery about their novel application of a contingency management intervention. In this case, they use CM procedures to reduce excessive social media use. Lesleigh is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Florida's Center for Behavioral Economic Health Research, and Jesse is a professor of psychology also at the University of Florida. If you're not sure what contingency management is, don't worry. Lesleigh and Jesse cover the basics of it in this show. And for additional information, you can also check out Jesse's previous appearance on the Inside JABA Series, where he and his colleagues used smartphone mediated technologies in conjunction with CM to reduce cigarette smoking. This is truly an under the dome paper, and in our discussion of it, we touch on topics that include internet addiction, the recent APA health advisory on social media use, motivational interviewing, stages of change, and we even talk about the benefits of single case designs. So we get into some nerdy research designs towards the end. So there's a little something here for everyone. I hope you really enjoy the show. This podcast, along with all the other Inside JABA Series shows and many other behavioral observations episodes, it's available for continuing education. So to learn more about that, go to behavioralobservations.com/get CEUs, and you'll see all the CEUs there for sale. I would also encourage you to check out the show notes for this episode. We mention a lot of resources, and I've done my best to track them down and put all the links there. You just have to go to behavioralobservations.com and click on the link for this episode. You can also sign up for the email list, and the email list basically is a mechanism for me to email the show notes directly to you after every show gets published. You don't have to go to any website at all. Unless, of course, you do want to buy CEs. We've already covered that. But the email list is a very efficient way to get the links and other resources that we mention in each podcast episode. And in those, one of those links is a link to subscribe to JABA. So if you're not a JABA subscriber and you want to support the flagship publication in our field, you can find out how to do that with in those show notes as well. And having said that, that's it for opening remarks again. So without any further delay, let's get to this fun conversation with Drs. Lesleigh Stinson, Jesse Dallery, and John Barrero.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
All right, we're here for the 15th installment of the Inside JABA Series. I say this every time we record one of these, but I can't believe we're at 15 already. And little did we know when Linda LeBlanc approached me, a couple years ago with this concept that we'd be doing so many episodes. So again, all of that to say, I'm really grateful for my guests to join me today. And I am joined by Drs. Lesleigh Stinson, Jesse Dallery, and Editor-in-Chief of JABA, Dr. John Barrero. Welcome, everyone. All right, so we've got a really fascinating article to discuss before we hit the record button. John was in full, I guess we'd say, gush mode, and I am on board with that. I've got my actual paper copy of JABA here that I'm holding up that obviously no one will be able to see because this is a podcast, but the article is called Reducing Problematic Social Media Use via a Package Intervention. And of course, that is in the spring 2023 issue of JABA, which came out just a couple of weeks ago. So there's a lot to get into in this paper. We've got a full page and then on to the second page of questions for you guys. And I think this work is very timely. As we were joking around before we hit record, I have some personal interest in this because there are times where I get caught up in this and I'm like, oh my gosh, I've been watching Reels for an embarrassing amount of time. And I also have 3 teenagers, so I am well acquainted with excessive smartphone use, both as a user and an observer. So I suspect many people in the audience will have a similar interest in this. And this is something that I think cannot be more under the dome, as Pat Fryman would say. than any other social issues. So all of that to say, I'm really happy that you guys were able to join us this morning. So I guess to start off here, what I'd like to do is I'm always curious about people's motivations for the work that they do. So uh, how did this problem come onto your radar screen, and what made you? We'll get into how you studied it, but what made you want to study it in the first place? So if we can, maybe talk about your motivation for getting into this work, and perhaps some descriptive information as it relates to the scope of the problem of social media use.
Yeah. So the primary reason that I think we chose social media use as our target response was because I think it influences my own life and the lives of many of my friends. I don't think I've talked to someone who's ever said, like, I think that I use social media use a good amount. Like, no one's really happy with how much they use it. And so when I was thinking of dissertation topics, it was also during COVID. And so I needed to do something that was remote. And this seemed to be the most impactful thing that I could do remotely. And I think I'm happy with that it seems to negatively affect a lot of peers, especially younger folks. So that's, I think, the sentimental reasons why we chose this response. Jesse, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I should mention that the American Psychological Association just issued a health advisory on social media use in adolescents. So that kind of really, it's good timing for this article, and highlights, I think, some of the motivations that Leslie mentioned. We really don't know a lot about social media use. Its connections to harm. There are very few experimental studies that have demonstrated harm directly. There's strong associations out there for sure, but we really don't know a lot. We don't know a lot about not just harm, but its potential beneficial effects, how to reduce it. This is one of the first experimental demonstrations of an intervention to reduce social media use. So that's saying quite a lot. We don't know a lot about prevention or assessment. So it's just a wide open area. And so when Leslie mentioned it, I was all thumbs up.
This is an interesting subject, because oftentimes when we think about the process of conducting an experiment, one of the first steps is to go to the literature and consume all the literature on the topic. But what I really like about the origin of this particular one is that it seems to have been kind of occasioned by just casual observation of what's going on in your world. Mm-hmm. And then you relied on this very large literature base with which you both have expertise in the form of contingency management, which we'll get to in a moment. But I just think that it's so important that you just saw what was going on around you. You heard your colleagues talking about it, perhaps parents of adolescents and teens, and then you designed an experiment to try to get at that challenge. So I just think that's an important source of motivation for research. Very cool.
Fully agree. Absolutely.
Yeah. If I recall correctly from the paper, there you said there's not a lot of research. There has been some, if I'm not mistaken. I'm kind of embarrassed to admit I didn't write the citation down in my notes here. But what were you able to learn from the whatever existing literature that there was on this topic? I know there's tons and tons of stuff on contingency management. I'd like to get into that as well. I think this would be a good opportunity to explain to listeners who aren't familiar with this technology what that is. But as it relates to this and social media use of the literature that is out there, what were you guys able to garner from it?
Sure. Well, when we actually started this study back in, I think it was 2020, there was nothing empirical. There were no empirical demonstrations of a treatment for problematic social media use. So there were a few studies out there within like cognitive psychology, where they would ask participants to abstain from social media use and then would measure things like happiness or well-being, but they never verified abstinence. So there was nothing empirical at the time. When we went to publish now, there were two studies that are quite similar and were great. I think the first one was Stanley et al. And then there was also, I apologize if I pronounce this incorrectly, but I believe it's Williams and Butari, which was also done in 2022. Those were both studies that used CM. One used problematic smartphone use, the Williams and Butari study. And the other one, looking at my notes. Stanley et al. Implemented CM for smartphone use with a contingency on social media use within the handle of smartphone use. So both of those did find that CM was effective in reducing smartphone use, but ours is a little bit more targeted specifically at social media use. But I'll let Jesse go into the extensive research on contingency management with other target behaviors.
Jesse, before you do that, I want to just make a note for the listeners. We will link the article itself as well as the those two references that you mentioned, Lesleigh, in the show notes. And just more generally, this as often these Inside JABA Series podcasts are, the show notes will be your friend in this episode because we'll have lots of links to point you in the right direction if you want to learn more about this stuff. We'll also link to the previous Inside JABA on the where we talked about smoking cessation and contingency management and things like that. So anyway, I just wanted to interject that. So long story short, go to behavioralobservations.com, check out the show notes for this episode. All right, go ahead, Jesse.
So contingency management. There's a large literature on contingency management, unlike empirical demonstrations of treatments for social media use. But the data with contingency management are pretty strong. But the procedure, just briefly, involves providing desirable consequences, usually monetary consequences, social consequences, based on objective, verifiable behavior change. In the case of substance use disorders, where it's been mostly used, that's in the form of biochemical verification of drug abstinence, either in urine or saliva or breath output. In the case of smoking cessation, it's breath carbon monoxide, which reflects how much smoke you recently inhaled. So there have been hundreds of studies using contingency management across all drug classes, showing large effect sizes. It's considered one of the most effective psychosocial treatments for drug dependence generally, better than relapse prevention and some cognitive behavioral treatments. It's also been extended to other behavioral topographies, medication adherence, physical activity, which we can measure also through digital technology, adherence to treatment-related goals, attendance at counseling and group sessions, for example. So it's this versatile, very powerful behavioral technology that's only expanded in recent years because of digital technology, the ability to use digital tools to monitor behavior. And that's also, I think, a key part of Lesleigh's study here, which is the ability to measure social media use in an objective way, in a reliable and objective way, which really kind of sets the stage for this behavioral technology of contingency management. So we were able to draw on the large literature and our work using digital contingency management to apply to this new target behavior.
Got it. So that gives everyone kind of a firm foundation to move forward on. So based on that foundation, then tell us a little bit about the nuts and bolts of the study. Let's get into it. What did, I'm curious about the whole entire process, from the recruitment of participants to the selection of the independent and dependent measures and things like that. So yeah, let's talk about that. I'm also, you guys had some really interesting things that you just kind of like I guess populated the article with that were probably springboards for either other studies or other conversations and things like that too. And one of them was, this little note about the treatment goal. Is it reduction versus abstinence? As you know, because that's a kind of a compare and contrast with, probably no one goes into this wanting to fully abstain from social media use. Whereas if someone has an alcohol or substance use disorder that is pretty destructive or harmful, abstinence might be a more logical goal. So that's another way in which this might be a little different and things like that. So I'm probably getting way ahead of ourselves here. So I'll stop talking and let you guys tell us a little bit more about this study.
Sure. So I think it's worth mentioning that our intervention was a little bit more than just contingency management. We used contingency management in conjunction with application limits. So if many of you probably have iPhones, those are notifications that you can turn on at a select amount of time. So you can say, I want a notification after I've been using this app for 30 minutes, and it will give you a reminder that you've reached your limit. And you can ignore that if you choose to and continue using the app. And we also used the selection of alternative activities that would be alternatives to social media use, presumably. We recruited participants by making Facebook posts and university-affiliated Facebook pages for students. Participants had to be between the ages of 18 and 24 and own an iPhone. And then we also were specifically recruiting individuals who wanted to reduce their social media use. There were also some requirements related to the operating systems if they owned a laptop, so that we could make sure screen time and our other program called Work Examiner would be compatible with their laptop. And we also had our potential participants take a modified version of the Internet Addiction Test to verify that they were, at least via self-report, at least mildly addicted to social media use. And then, as you mentioned, we had the participants select their own goals. We wanted this to be a socially valid study. We wanted them to choose something that they felt like would potentially improve their own well-being. And to do that, we gave them a little bit of guidance from the literature. There are a couple of studies out there relating to the duration of social media use. A study called Levinson et al. From 2016 found that social media use was correlated with sleep disturbances. And there's another study out there about the duration of social media use being correlated with higher likelihood of internalizing problems. So we gave them this and said, choose your goal. And so, they chose their own goals for this study.
Yeah, and that brings up a good point, Matt, that you also mentioned regarding total abstinence versus reduction. And I think it speaks to social validity as well. I mean, there are some data suggesting, again, experimental data, that social media can have beneficial effects in terms of empathy building and self-esteem, self-reported self-esteem. So there's some potential benefits of social media use. And so it seemed like a more socially valid goal to just focus on reductions as opposed to abstinence. This is true in the substance use disorder field as well. There are some studies suggesting that controlled drinking is a viable goal, but it's a complicated picture where the decisions really have to be made on a case-by-case basis. So it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of approach. But that's the sort of the heart of this goal in this study. It's to ask each individual what's a valid goal for you, and we can provide some guidance around information that might help inform that decision, as Leslie mentioned.
Yeah, and I think this is definitely getting ahead of ourselves. A great area for when there is more research out on the duration of social media use, like maybe there will be better recommendations about what's acceptable or what the specific durations that are correlated or causally related to psychological problems. But for now, we don't have that. So this is how we chose to go about that.
What did you? So you mentioned a couple of things like tools that you use to collect baseline data in terms of screen time and things along those lines. I know there were a few comments about some of the limitations of those things. Could you speak to that? And also, when you kind of got a sense of where the participants were in, pre-intervention, did anything surprise you, or we were like, oh my gosh, were these people, in terms of the duration and frequency of their social media use?
The screen time limitations were surprising to us. They were interesting. So screen time is available on iPhones and laptops or computers in general. And what we found that screen time is most accurate when measuring activity duration on an iPhone. So screen time rounds down to the nearest minute for each episode of activity. So for example, if you're on Instagram for 5 minutes and 30 seconds, it's going to record that as 5 minutes. And then if you're on it again for 3 minutes and 7 seconds, it's going to add just 3 minutes to that total. So it is a pretty close estimate, but it's not exactly precise. However, with laptops, it's less accurate. So generally, it does the same procedure. So it also rounds down with activity. But if you have an app open and then you open a second app in the foreground or third or fourth, you can have multiple, it's going to continue recording the duration of the apps that are open, even if they're in the background and not active, currently being used. So that can be a major limitation depending on how someone uses their laptop. And for us, it did seem to be a factor in one of our participants' laptop use data.
So if I may interject here, just to make sure I'm understanding you correctly. So if someone's like me and they have 1,000 browser tabs open and Twitter's on one of them and Facebook's on the other, but I promise people I'm actually doing work and perhaps even in another application. I might be in Word or GarageBand or something like that, and it's counting Facebook and Twitter as being active, and it's counting the time that those are open. Is that do I have it correct?
This is actually a very fine distinction that I should specify. So if you have Safari open and you have 1 million tabs open, it's only measuring the tab that is active, the foremost tab. However, if you have Safari open and then you open another window, so not a tab, if it's operating in the background, it's still recording. So if it's just tabs, it's not recording multiple activities. But if you have different windows open, it is continuing to record.
And was this something that you had to coach the participants over? And I apologize because I can't remember the details of this, and there's a fair bit of nuance. But did that require you guys to coach the participants on some, I guess, browser usage behavior so that you could get a more accurate reading of their use, or was that just something that you discovered after the fact and just kind of, I guess, accepted that as noise, if you will?
Yeah. So we actually did this validity test after we conducted the study. So yeah, we found out afterwards that this was a limitation. However, yeah, like I said, it seemed to be consistent with what our participants reported, because one of our participants who had very high laptop use data, he was the only participant who had high levels of social media use on his computer. He told us that he had a chat app open in the background, and he rarely actually used it, maybe for he self-reported, I think, around 20 minutes of use, but we were getting hours. So our direct observation was consistent with his report.
Could I take a step back for a moment? I had a question about this, and I'm wondering if others might as well. When you were describing the nature of the challenge, you described how you did this internet addiction test. And one of the things that we communicated about in the process of finalizing the manuscript was how to talk about this. So when we think about social media use, is it an addiction? Is it something that is problematic? And how do those different ways of talking about it influence what we've learned so far about this literature?
That's a good question. And I feel like I'm talking too much. So Jesse, feel free to interject at any time.
So yeah, it is a good question. I think as to whether or not it should be characterized as an addiction similar to other addictive, say, substances like drugs, it's somewhat too early to say. I think more research is needed. I don't know to what extent it really influences, practically speaking, what we do, because this is, right now anyway, a matter of, do I have a problem? Or parents saying, does my child have a problem? And whether we call that problematic behavior or addictive behavior, I don't think it influences what we do, practically speaking. At other levels, policy levels, funding levels, I think that those terms then may make a difference. If it's categorized as an addictive behavior, that might unlock some funding, for example, that's not available. But yeah, I think what we would characterize the behavior as operant behavior, sensitive to its consequences. And we have this beautiful conceptual and practical technology that we can bring to bear, and that won't change based on those terms. So that's my view. And I think I know there are probably others that would disagree with that, but I'm going to stick with that for now.
Okay.
There's also some research right now, as Jesse pointed out. There's a little bit of a debate over whether it is an addiction or not, and some studies have said that not all of the essential components of an addiction are present with social media use. So yeah, there are many terms that this goes by in the literature. Some studies refer to it as social media addiction, social media dependence. But it looks like for now, the APA has landed on problematic social media use. And as Jesse said, terms don't really determine how we treat it or intervene.
Yeah, thank you for that. And to that last point that both of you made, I believe that one of the last recommendations put forth by this expert panel was increased funding to address and assess. So it's just, as you said earlier, just really great timing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
All right. John, thanks for that clarification. That was helpful to talk about that. So, all right. So what, I guess one more kind of participant-based question here. Did any of their goals, as you said, they self-selected their goals. Did any of their goals kind of surprise you in terms of either being, too optimistic, or conversely, like really, really, just shaving off at the edges in terms of their social media use? Or did they, I don't know how we define what a reasonable goal is, but did they seem reasonable, or were there occupants of all of those categories and even in between? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, I can start with that. Yeah, it was interesting. There's quite a bit of variability in terms of social media use during baseline. I mean, some about an hour and a half, up to 8 to 10 hours per day. And there's some variability, right, day to day, but there's quite a bit of variability, and that level of variability is also reflected in the goals they set. So those that were at high levels, their goals were relatively high compared to those that were at low levels at baseline. But still, there was variability in the goals. So about a little less than an hour to up to about 3 hours per day in terms of goals. And I was a bit struck that 3 hours was considered a valid goal. That seems like quite a bit. But we don't know what an acceptable level is and how to define that for an individual. 3 hours could be perfectly reasonable. It's to the extent that it interferes with their functioning in other domains, education, relationships, their personal life. So to the extent that is no interference, and then I think that could be a perfectly reasonable goal. But I was still surprised by the wide variability, and so I think does that address your question?
Yeah. I was just curious to see what what your subjective impressions were of how people self-selected their goals. And again, it's a different, I guess, school of thought, per our discussion a few minutes earlier, in terms of someone with a very harmful repertoire of some other type of excessive behavior versus social media, which is not to say it's not harmful, but
right.
I think all right.
Can I ask something about that? I was thinking about as a graduate student, I think a full-time TA job, teaching assistant role, is 20 hours a week. And I was trying to kind of conceptualize this. One of your users was on the order of 23 hours per week after intervention. And as you're talking, I'm thinking it would be really neat to just, on a descriptive level, capture how frequently individuals between the ages of 18 and 24 are using social media. But what you've added to this literature, which is so important, is that it's an objective measurement. So you could get at some of those factors and try to parse out who are the kind of heavy users, whatever that means, and then what characteristics those folks are bringing to the table, as well as light users and so on. So it just seems like a very objective way to capture the extent and scope of this challenge that we face now.
Definitely. Yeah, that's an excellent idea for future study. Yep.
All right. So we have the concept down. We have the participants. So tell us a little bit about the intervention itself. What did you guys arrange to help these participants reduce their social media use?
We had a couple components. The first one was that we had them set the goal, of course, and then we had them earn money for meeting their goal. So during baseline condition, they could earn $1 for submitting their data. And then once we moved into the intervention, participants earned $7 for meeting their goal on the first day. And then that was an escalating contingency. So each day that they continued meeting their goal, they could earn up to $9. And if they were still submitting their data, they could earn a total of $10, right, for meeting their goal. It was a resetting contingency. So if they missed a day or did not meet their goal, they went back down to the earning level of $7 and earned their way back up that way. We also had participants select 3 alternative activities. So we did give them a list of activities just to kind of use as a springboard, and they were able to choose whatever activity they would like for that. And we talked about ways to increase the likelihood that they would actually engage in those activities. So for example, if you chose reading, we would say, maybe you can download an ebook, or you can put a book in your purse to carry it around, things like that.
And so what did you guys learn from this? How sensitive were the participants to this arrangement?
Yeah, so very sensitive in the sense that baseline, only about 27% of their social media use was below the goal that they set, whereas during treatment, about 92% of days were below the threshold for social media use. So some very encouraging results that this package intervention can reduce social media use. Also showing that on the internet addiction test, that most participants dropped a level, from either moderate addiction to mild addiction, or mild addiction to no addiction. So suggesting that there's some social validity in terms of the level of self-reported addiction. So yeah, what we learned is that it's this behavior, as complex as it is, and as in some ways poorly understood as it is in terms of functional dimensions and other dimensions, is sensitive to alternative reinforcers. Potentially, of course, we don't know that because it's a package intervention. But it's sensitive to some behavioral processes that we, have well characterized, and that's encouraging.
And do you have a sense as to what they were able to earn? Was the amount of money earned meaningful? I know that's a very ambiguous term, but I'm just curious: is it the idea of earning money in general, or is there some sensitivity to monetary rewards that might be highly individualized? Someone is not particularly strapped for cash. Would the intervention be less effective? I don't know if that's something that you guys were able to look at and just didn't get a chance to report, or if there are data out there from other contingency management interventions, whether applied towards social media use or not, that can speak to that.
Mm-hmm. Well, go ahead, Leslie.
I can speak to it within our own study, and I'm sure Jesse can give us some other background. But within our own study, participants earned between $87 and $192. However, so the reason that we chose the earning level that we did choose at $10 a day was because with a pilot participant, we tried a lower magnitude contingency management of starting out at the $3 level and working up to $5, and that was not effective. So for us, the $10 seemed to matter more. The magnitude of the earning did seem to matter. We didn't collect data on their socioeconomic status or whether they were earning income outside of that. So with this specific study, we can't answer that question, but I do know that there is some other research to that question.
Yeah. So in the general substance use disorder literature, when income, for example, has been assessed as a predictor of success, there has been no linkage between income and treatment success. So Nancy Petrie has looked at this a few times, and so that's the case in the general literature. But I think that it's a really good question, and as to whether there is some individual sensitivity to these reinforcers. One might imagine, for example, that someone who's severely depressed may be less sensitive across the board to all sources of reinforcement. I mean, that's sort of the definition of anhedonia, which is a characteristic of major depression. So for those kinds of individuals, and that would be representative of some of these, for example, young adults, adolescents, who may be experiencing some of the really negative effects of potentially social media use. Again, we don't have causal data that might produce some serious levels of depression and anxiety. So it's an interesting and I think open question, but with respect to the larger, CM literature, there's no linkage, at least between income and outcome.
Thank you. Were there other aspects of the results that maybe came as a surprise that you didn't expect? Were there any self-reports about, from the participants themselves about, maybe some subjective, outcomes, maybe greater feelings of well-being, or what have you, or contacting other contingencies? I know we've kind of referenced these things tangentially thus far, but any I guess, anecdotes or other types of stories that come to mind that are worth mentioning? I always wonder when these papers get submitted to JABA, I'm like, there's got to be so many things that are just left out that are cool, but just either, don't fit space-wise or, for whatever reason, I suppose. But are there aspects of this that didn't make it into the final paper, the final publication that are noteworthy?
For me, I was I don't know if I was surprised. I guess I would say interested that for one participant, this intervention was effective at first and then stopped being effective. His levels of social media use went back up to baseline levels. And then he I would say, kind of dropped out. He stopped responding, didn't complete any of the rest of the surveys. And so I would love to have more information about that and, what variables controlled that. Was it sensitivity to the specified reinforcers? What makes something effective in the short term and not in the long term? So I think maybe just a lot of interest around that. And generally, the participants reported really enjoying the intervention in the place where they could submit like free-form feedback. They all had really nice things to say. So that was great.
I see. And do you have plans to follow up with these folks down the road? And I assume that they're not, they're no longer earning for moderating their social media use. I'm just I'd be curious, just whether it's informal or not, just to see if these are, if you could consider the CM, the intervention that might there be some natural contingencies to take over that maintains a more moderate social media usage going forward, perhaps in the absence of the contingency management intervention.
Yeah, that's a great point. We actually had plans to follow up with the participants, each of them a couple of weeks after. I think we chose, Jesse, do you remember 12 weeks or something? But this was a failing on my part. I was pregnant and I failed to follow up with them. So that would be great data to have, to know. My inclination is that the effects of the intervention probably didn't maintain long-term, but that is definitely a direction that I would love to go in the future.
Yeah, definitely. I was curious about it. And I think that's perhaps a segue into my next question here, because as I was reading this paper, it reminded me some other papers that I had read by my good friend Jim Murphy from the University of Memphis, who is my go-to guy on all things behavioral economics, substance and alcohol use disorders, etc. He's done some really interesting work, and I'll link to his episode where he came on the podcast and talked about motivational interviewing. And Jim, if you're listening to this, I'm sorry I screwed this up, but basically my understanding of some of the work he's done is that they've had really great success moderating binge drinking amongst college students and young people in general by doing a 1 to 2 visit type of intervention where they talk about they go through they take kind of like an inventory of how often these individuals consume alcohol, and then they basically provide some psychoeducation about the impacts of it, and they have the person reflect on, like, maybe have these things negatively impacted you? What are some, if you're going to drink, here are some things to do so in such a way that you reduce harm, and so on and so forth. And again, this is the total cliff notes of this, folks, so just bear with me here. But the idea is that with they've had really good success getting young adults to moderate binge drinking based off of 1 or 2 sessions of, kind of based out of the motivational interviewing type of literature. And so when I was reading this, I was wondering if there's an avenue for that in terms of future research, in terms of talking with participants and saying, hey, excessive social media use, fill in the blank, harm, here are some strategies. Maybe you delete Facebook off your phone or Instagram off your phone and have to manually log in. You increase the response effort. I know people who have done that, and it's helped them. You put a couple extra steps in place to make the response effort higher to engage in that behavior, and that's been a helpful strategy. So, the reason why I'm kind of going in that direction in terms of being curious about future research is that doesn't require the contingency management apparatus and frankly, the money that goes along with that. I'm curious what thoughts you guys might have about that as other directions to take this in.
Yeah, it's a great question. And yeah, Jim's work is very interesting and provocative. I think, and just briefly around MI, motivational interviewing, just to provide a context for what that is, it's a talk therapy intervention. It's sort of a method of communication to help clients overcome ambivalence or lack of motivation to change behavior. One big focus is developing this discrepancy between one's goals and values and their current behavior. So do they value health? If so, how is alcohol use compatible with that value, for example? Also eliciting and encouraging, reinforcing change talk being talking about changing your behavior in a direction that's consistent with your goals and values. There's more to it than that, but those are some of the key ingredients to MI. Christopher and Dewar have an awesome article in The Behavior Analyst that was published in 2009, which is a behavior analytic interpretation of MI, which is one of my it's just a very fun read. It's one of my favorite articles.
All right, so I gotta track that one down. You say Christopher what?
Christopher and Mike Dewar in 2009. Yeah, in The Behavior Analyst. And,
got it. Thank you.
Just great job unpacking the social contingencies, verbal processes, rule-governed behavior. All those things that are might occasion behavior change following MI.
Thank you.
I think MI could certainly be used to reduce social media use. The focus on a discrepancy between, say, sitting on the couch scrolling for hours and the value of being healthy physically and or mentally. So building that discrepancy, helping a participant, adolescent, young adult, whomever, talk about how they might change behavior, what kinds of activities would reflect their values and goals, how could they engage in those activities. I think it's a wide open empirical question.
Sure.
It could be used in conjunction with CM. I mean, MI is used often in conjunction with other interventions. It can be used as a standalone, but it doesn't have to. So it would be a nice marriage of the two.
Yeah, I guess the advantage of perhaps using it in a alcohol or substance use scenario is that the harms are perhaps more well understood at this stage, and you don't get a hangover from watching too many YouTube videos. I mean, you may feel subjectively like unmotivated, and you might be up. It might increase some I don't know, some subjective distress as it relates to not getting other things done on your to-do list. But you're not going to get hungover. You're not going to get arrested. You're not going to, this stuff, this. So the downsides are perhaps of social media use are perhaps trickier to define and make concrete, I suppose. I'm speculating here, but.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, and I think we need more characterization of those downsides. I think it really may depend on what the video is. If for a young girl, for example, watching a video of others, and we say she has body image issues of other attractive women, that could have serious negative consequences. And again, these are linkages, but I think the number was 57% of adolescent girls that report significant levels of depression and anxiety, and high rates of self-harm, and there's been an increase in suicide. Again, there's many cultural factors that might be responsible, but there are these linkages in the literature between social media use and some of these negative outcomes.
Yeah, I think that's something the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt's written about a number of times, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have a question for you both, perhaps. I'm wondering if there's a quantification of this discrepancy, because frequently I imagine that those who are most motivated to change may be most sensitive to these contingencies, wherein the contingencies are exactly the same, but the motivation that the individual participant brings to the study may differentially impact the outcomes that are observed. So in this motivational interviewing literature, is there a way to say that participant A has this level of motivation, but participant B has this level, and then perhaps those contingencies might differentially affect those two?
So the contingencies for CM or MI?
Well, I meant the discrepancy essentially. So can you point to this person and say that person's going to be more successful because their discrepancy is larger relative to this other person whose discrepancy is smaller, for example? I'm not sure if I'm using the right language.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know the answer to that one offhand, but it's a really interesting question. I'd have to think about it. Nothing is standing out. Leslie, I'm not sure if you're.
Yeah, I don't know of a way to quantify that specific discrepancy. I know in some of the research that I've seen, they ask participants, like, how motivated are you to change on a scale of 1 to 10? And so I think that right now, that's kind of the best that we have is that self-report. But yeah, I think that you're very right that someone's motivation is going to alter the effectiveness of the reinforcer for sure.
Yeah, I think just starting with that question seems like a really good place to start, and then you can perhaps figure out some other ways to formalize that. But somebody who says I'm a 10 out of 10 on motivation to change, you might expect them to perform differently when given these opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
Very
right.
Cool.
And I think that ties in very well to what Matt was saying, that we don't know that much about social media use. So I think it's very easy to justify it and say to ourselves, it's not so bad. And so that can then in turn affect how long we sit and scroll. So yeah, I think that's very important, our own verbal behavior in regards to how bad we think it is for us.
Yeah. To your question, John, I think there's, if there are people from a counseling or psychotherapy background listening to this, they're probably like stages of change, yeah. And there's a whole formulation of that, and I'm just not well equipped enough to know whether or not there's any type of further quantification of that, or to Leslie's point, is a self-report in terms of where you are on that continuum of being completely unaware of the problem versus, I'm motivated to really make a difference.
Yeah, there are some measures out there, stages of change ladder, and to assess motivation, self-reported motivation. I'm more familiar in the CM literature with that kind of work. It doesn't seem to really predict a whole lot. If anything, the main predictor of success is severity of use prior to CM. There's a meta-analysis looking at individual differences in CM called, I think it's called Eyes on the Prize, Individual Differences in Contingency Management. I may be butchering the title a little bit, but basically one of the nice things about CM is it works regardless of just about any individual difference factor. So sociocultural differences, as I mentioned earlier, income, to a large extent, even psychiatric comorbidities. So it's a good thing in many ways that regardless of individual differences, it works, which is not to say that we shouldn't continue to focus, obviously, on individual differences. And there's very little work on function-based intervention or function-based assessment and outcomes with CM. So there's still more work to be done in that area. But yeah, it works across the board, I guess.
That's also comforting, I suppose, at the same time, right? That right. Regardless of what scenario you find yourself in, that there's an intervention that has a high degree of success. So I know the paper is, it's brand new. It's only been in print for a couple of weeks, and I don't know how long it's been available online in terms of being able to be searched in databases and things like that. But I'm wondering, has this paper caught the attention? Have you guys gotten any inquiries from other people, maybe outside of the world of behavior analysis, maybe in the popular, press media or anything like that? Because this sounds like something that would there's a lot of discussion, I suppose, in society about the proper role of social media usage or concern with the excessive use of social media. So I'm just curious, what, if any, outreach that you guys might have gotten from this.
Yeah, I haven't. Jesse, have you?
No. Aside from this podcast, not yet. Not yet,
breaking news on behavioral
breaking news, yeah,
observations.
hot off the press.
Hold on a second. On the encouraging side, your paper has been viewed over 2,300 times already. So that's a good sign that folks are getting some eyes on this. So I think
That's
this is
great.
important.
That's great to hear.
All right. Operators are standing by.
Yep.
So
We'll stand by the phone.
that's awesome. Well, that's really encouraging for sure.
Could I just say a couple of things about some of the aspects of this paper that I think were just so noteworthy and if I may suggest, even elegant in terms of design perspectives. I think it was so clever of you both to focus on the laptop use. And the way that I was thinking about it is this could be like response reallocation. So your phone locks you out. And I don't know if it's the same measurement system on both devices, but you put one down and pick the other up. And I just thought it was so clever. And I think ultimately you found that was not that was not what was happening, right?
Right.
But it seemed like a good idea to measure it. And I just thought that was really, really quite brilliant.
I think that, yeah, we were fascinated by that too, because I think that I assumed that someone would just move to the next device. But yeah, it seems potentially, I don't know, the response effort might be much higher to go get your computer and log in. So yeah, we didn't see that, which I think is a good thing.
Right. And then the other two features I just thought were really great because of the social validity aspect. We've talked about them, but I thought it was such a good idea to measure alternative activities and to try to get an idea of what folks might be interested in. Again, if you're going to stop doing one thing, it makes so much sense. And I think it's so important to emphasize that you give them another thing to do. And I thought that you did that so nicely. And then also in the social validity realm, the idea of setting your own goals. I just thought, like, how cool is that? Even for the individuals who are excessive users, you just put the goal in an achievable way because they set it for themselves. So just really great work and great procedural choices that you made.
Thank you, John. Yep.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right. I don't have any other questions right now. John, I don't know if there's any on your list that you'd want to ask before we wrap up here.
I have one, if that's okay. As this is the Inside JABA podcast, I personally am extremely grateful that you decided that JABA would be an outlet for this work. But I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about your decision to choose JABA for this work. As you say in the paper, it's the first empirical demonstration of a CM package. So I feel as though this paper is going to bring a lot of important attention to JABA, as it already has by page views. So could you speak a little bit about the factors that went into your decision-making to choose JABA as an outlet for this work?
Sure. I think, there are two reasons. One is more practical in the sense that we did use a single case experimental design. And of course, JABA is renowned for its rigor in that domain. And there is a growing interest in single case experimental designs in health behavior research, broadly speaking. My view is that there's this somewhat, is maybe too strong a word, renaissance of single case approaches across the board. Mainly, one big reason is because of the use of digital technology to assess behavior and behavior products. So there are journals like Translational Behavioral Medicine or even Health Psychology, and there are others that would have been amenable. But I think JABA is certainly a more natural home for a single case approach. So there's a practical reason, but also, I think it's true for both Lesleigh and I. We're passionate about behavior analysis and, expanding the range of behaviors that we can successfully assess, prevent, and intervene upon. So, it's this hope that we could continue to expand this collection of socially significant behavior that behavior analysts could tackle with our, conceptual, practical treatment approaches. I think that's the aspirational reason, in addition to the practical one.
Very cool.
It's
cool. Interesting. You mentioned this renaissance in single case design. One of the areas I think this is, at the risk of taking us down a rabbit hole, hopefully a brief one. But I've had on the podcast, Jesse, your former student Nick Green a couple of times, and I always think of the work that he does, and more generally the field of strength and conditioning or exercise science or what have you. That's an area that is ripe for single case research, for the very reason that if you're looking at individual behavior change, it makes sense to have that type of preparation versus a group's design where you're comparing two different types of either strength training or conditioning protocols and things along those lines. So so I'm happy to hear that to the extent to which a renaissance is occurring in this, that's that is indeed occurring.
Yeah, I have a biased sample, right? Because I only see what I see, but I do think that there is evidence for that. There's now an N of one collaborative, which is an international organization. There's a website for that. There are special sections and issues of journals focused on single case approaches. Harvard Data Science just published one special issue on single case. They also have different terms for these designs: personalized medicine approaches, N of one approach, as opposed to single case experimental designs, which is what, of course, we're more familiar with.
All right. Well, is there? If there's any final word about the study, I'd like to give you guys the opportunity to mention it here. And if not, congratulations on an awesome paper. I really enjoyed reading it. It has, like I said, personal relevance to virtually everyone in my house. So my wife is actually the most disciplined social media user, at least in the Sequoia household, but probably beyond that. She's really, really good at that, and is a good model for our teens to the extent to which they choose to follow it. But that's a podcast perhaps for a different day. But yeah. Thanks so much, guys, for coming on and chatting about this really, really interesting paper.
Thanks so much for having us. Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you for choosing JABA for this work. Please keep that good work coming.
Yeah. Thank you. I do have one final thing that I did want to share. And I think this is for everyone who feels like they struggle with problematic social media use, as you were saying that so many of us, was that we actually tried before we landed on contingency management. We had a couple pilot participants, and we tried a lot of interventions. We tried goal setting, self-monitoring, graphical and verbal feedback, and none of them worked. And so I think that speaks to kind of how hard it is to change. So I think we can all be a little bit nicer to ourselves when we get frustrated that, our applicants aren't controlling our behavior. So, and I also I think that the study opens up a lot of questions that behavior analysts are really well poised to answer, especially in terms of identifying causal relationships. There's not a lot of research on that now. So I think I'm excited to see where others take this too.
Fantastic. Yep. Thanks for ending on a compassionate note. So, all right, keep up the good work, guys. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sicoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.